Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on market design for an integrated and renewable energy system. My name is Salvatore Vinci. I'm the head of partnership and technical advisory services in IRENA, and I'm very happy to be the moderator of this session. Just a few introductory remarks regarding to introduce the session. If we look what's happening in the energy sector, in the power sector globally, but since we are in Bonn, we can have a look at the European case. We have seen what the dramatic change in the past 20 years. If we look at the three sources of generation, natural gas, wind, and solar photovoltaics in the past 20 years, we can see the trend from 90 to 99. We can see what happened after that. We still increasing demand, but together with gas, growing production from wind. And this is what happened in the past 10 years. Now, visually, you know already these numbers and these figures, but it's quite impressive to see how the situation and the system today is completely different of what was a few years ago. And this, of course, also in the market design area, where today the conditions are completely different from the one that were present a few years ago. We will see during the session what are the implications of this change and this situation in terms of lowering wholesale prices, in terms of volatility of prices, in terms of economic viability of flexible generation demand, but certainly this is a trend that is going to continue. And another trend that is going to continue is the increasing number of generation connecting at distribution level and a more active role of consumers. Also in this case, we will see the implication, and we have seen already in the discussion yesterday, the implication in terms of importance of demand response, in terms of a more active management of the distribution system, in terms of interaction, new interaction between TSOs and DSOs, in terms of tariff regulation. Some of these points will emerge during the discussion today, but certainly what is important to keep in mind, this trend is going to continue no matter what. What we need to do is to make sure that the process is efficient, that reliability and security of supply is guaranteed, and the socio-economic benefits are maximized. Certainly a fundamental aspect to take into consideration is the need for flexibility. We need a flexible power system. We need to work in a holistic approach on all aspects related to this objective. Here there are a few of them. Supply side, flexible generation, demand side, on transmission and distribution network, on storage, as we have seen also yesterday, on system operation, and on market design indeed. On market design, last year we have published this report, Adapting Market Design to High Share of Variable Renewable Energy. The report is free download from the IRENA website, where we have tried to gather some lessons learned on wholesale market design in day ahead, in intraday, in balancing market, and also we had looked at the distribution network and distributed energy source. So at the two parts of the equation. Obviously, as mentioned, the market is so dynamic that it's difficult to have a clear recommendation, but it's important to continue following and to analyze this aspect more in depth. And this is the concept of the session today. We will build on some of the findings of the report, and we will deep dive a little more to try to understand what are the challenges, but also what are the solutions that we can take into consideration. I am very happy that today we have a panel with very knowledgeable speakers. And we will start with Javier Casal, who is a colleague from IRENA. Then we will have Donna Peng. She is a research associate at Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and associate at Aurora Energy Research. We have Ivan Cayeme Villarreal, Director General at the Ministry of Energy in Mexico. Then we have Christopher Martel, Director of Operation Engineering at Global Sustainable Energy Solutions, and David Nelson, Executive Director at the Climate Policy Initiative. As you can see, is a very interesting mix of speakers, and without further delay, I would like to invite Javier to deliver your presentation. Please, I would like to ask all of you, starting from you, Javier, to keep in mind the time limit that we have, because I would like also to open the floor to some questions later on. Thank you very much.
So, good morning. If we can have the next presentation, we are going to have here a fast overview of what we are doing and setting a bit the context, because we won't be able to touch in all the issues, but they are heavily interrelated, so it's important to keep a global view, and then trying to put forward also some big elements that they won't be touched directly, but that they are associated to the discussion we are having, so that we can have them present during the presentations and maybe pick them up during the debate. But besides the report that Salvatore was commenting before from IRENA, we are working on another report on, let's say, power system setups, going beyond markets and trying to incorporate also more regulated power systems to see what are the challenges, the conceptual elements on the challenges for the transition, and trying to move a bit beyond the current situation where we are trying to fix the issues that we find along the way and looking to what kind of market or regulated system we need in the future for dealing with a system based on renewables, which is the final point from the transition we initiated today. No? So the first thing is this one. It won't be maybe that much present on the discussion we have now, but both liberalized and regulated systems, unbundled and integrated systems, they are facing similar transition challenges, and they can use similar transition tools. Both markets and regulation are intervening in both of them, and collaboration, it's missing in both of them also, and the three of them probably they will become part of the answer on how to manage the challenges from renewables, the higher CapEx intensity, the low OpEx operation, the distribution of energy resources, flexibility requirements, system integration, and higher social involvement in the planning and operation of the system. So fundamentally, the issue we are facing is that we have a current power system set up, and I'll use the word set up for meaning both markets and regulated systems. For this, it doesn't make a big difference, which was designed and based for fossil fuel-based power systems on a centralized and unidirectional operation. And it was working properly like this. But now we stepped into a transition process, and we have very strong drivers to advance even faster along this transition process, and we find ourselves on a current situation where we are going towards a renewable energy-based power system, which is decentralized, which is bidirectional, and we are trying to manage it with the current power system setup, be it a market, be it a regulated framework, by introducing different fixes. And these fixes, very often, they have to do with regulation. And here is where both regulated and liberalized market, they come a bit together because they are using the same kind of tools, and often they are not interfering or speaking to each other properly, and they create barriers and they create more noise. So the goal would be, for having some overview of where we are going, to look at what would be a power system fit for the kind of renewable-based energy system beyond the power itself that we want to operate. And the difference can be between failure or success on completing the transition. So what we are going to have now in the session will be structured like in 3 blocks. The first block, we are going to have a presentation about the disruption context. Where does it come, this disruption, and how we can understand it and therefore get better tools for dealing with it. Then we'll go through another block that analyzes current advancements, because we are already doing things that are aligned with what we need in the future, but probably the pieces, they are not put together. But there are good experiences and some of the tools we already tested that they could become important parts of the final solution. And then on the next block, we'll try to give an overview of what could be a power system, a market, or a setup, let's say in general, if it's regulated, which could be more orientated and fit for dealing with renewable-based energy systems. So that's the overview of the session. Now I would like to put on the table like 3 big subjects for interrelated with what we are going to be seeing, and maybe we can pick them up later, or if not, keep on thinking about them. One is the grid or load defection issue. Another one is the role and accommodation of new stakeholders in this process. And the other one is putting questions about whether we can improve the way the system works if we add collaboration to the competition, mainly addressed to market systems. So the grid or load defection issue, we see a very clear driver, and it has been already commented. Grid prices are increasing, both because of the need of overhauling the grid, but also because there are less consumers taking energy off the grid. So it's a trend that it's there, and distributed energy resources, they are reducing. So we come to a very interesting point where grid and utilities need to convince about its value. So it's not the only option anymore, and therefore they need to convince and to put into value this offer that they are making to society as a whole. And this is positive. It can be very positive. It can be negative depending on how we manage it. And the forecast on how much of the load could be defected, this is a case for the States from the Rocky Mountain Institute. In the 30s, you see that more than half of the demand is already defected from the load, and it's a rather conservative hypothesis, the ones they are using. So it could go very fast, this situation. There are many drivers. One is the cost, the primary driver, but there are other drivers that built into it, like cost stability, knowing exactly how much will it cost the next 20 or 30 years, the environment, ancillary provision of services, deferral of grid upgrades, trust in utilities, resilience. There are many drivers that could give a justification for this load defection. So here we have 2 ways to follow. One is that we adapt and potentiate the synergies between these two kinds of markets that somehow they are collapsing, the one of the utility-based market for supplying electricity and the one of off-grid market supplying electricity. They could collapse and become an integrated market, which is the figure on the right, where we still have the grid playing a big role. We have pro-users that are using but are also producing energy. We have meters putting a barrier between one zone and another one, and we have an overall integrated power market that includes autonomous systems, but that they are speaking with the grid. Or we could go the other way and failure to adapt and convince about the grid value, and therefore we would practically miss the grid, and we would be looking to a future where users could be practically off-grid from the power if we follow the trends on costs. So we are in a fork, in a decision process, and depending on the decisions we take today, both regarding regulation, both regarding the business models that we put in place, and both also implying how we modify the tariffs, that is the relationship, the final relationship between utilities and users, and what things we put in value, that we could lead to one place or another one completely different. There are clearly a lot of values associated to the grid, but they are probably not strongly put ahead as of today. No? They could avoid increasing energy and wealth inequality, because if we go this grid defection path, the ones that will be paying for most of the infrastructure are the ones that have less resources. It could facilitate the sharing economy and collaborative approaches, like system services from distributed energy resources and minimizing transition costs. It could facilitate citizens' involvement, which is a fundamental tool for reaching a successful transition, and it could facilitate overall system integration. So there are big values on keeping connected to the grid, but we need to establish a new relationship. About new stakeholders, what role do they have and how do we accommodate them? So in a renewable-based energy system, we know there are going to be, and they are already jumping into the stage, we are already seeing them, many different stakeholders with different drivers and different motivations and different capabilities to offer services. We have community-based renewable energy, we have corporate-based renewable energy, aggregation, power-to-X, vehicle-to-grid, distributed demand response, power-to-power, peer-to-peer trade, storage. We have many elements that are stepping into the stage, and we need to see how to coordinate them and how to make them participate in a synergic way. No? We have a current status from each one of these stakeholders. They are facing different situations, they are facing different barriers, and we need to set the appropriate context between regulation, markets, and participation. And it's a big issue. Unless we manage to involve all of them in a synergic way, we can end up on a system that is far more messy than the one we could have, even if we keep with the current structure. And then the other point I would like to put on the table also, it's what about going beyond competition? I mean, we are pushing ahead competition always as the big solver from all problems. In fact, the systems that are currently not liberalized, the trend they have, it's moving towards liberalization, but at the same time, in parallel, we are fixing liberalized systems with regulation to support renewables, and this introducing noise. So do we have room for improving the interaction between the different stakeholders, adding to the benefits of competition, which are clear, like the reduction of price on a competitive context, adding those things that competition is not delivering properly to society, like higher social costs, because they are not driving the competitive evolution, and the social value that it's providing to the whole of society. So if we would have this room, which would allow increasing participation, reducing inequality, and aligning competitive drivers with social requirements, it would be great that we start exploring it now that we are reconsidering how to reshape the whole of the power system setup or energy system setup, so that we don't miss important elements on the way ahead. So on here, I would leave it just in time, so I kept the promise. So cannot be, and give place to the other speakers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Javier. You highlighted very important point. One of them was, and I'm sure that will emerge again, the importance that tariff regulations will have in this context of decentralized generation, and in the context of make sure that the benefit of the renewables are for the entire system as a whole and not only for some individuals. I'm sure we will go back to these issues. Now let me please give the floor to Donna Peng. Please, Donna, keep in mind, Javier was very good in keeping the time. Maybe you can be the Thank you.
So, hi everyone. It is my great pleasure today to be speaking to you about my observations on the impact of renewable integration on market design. So, the thoughts that I have here are none of them are completely original. However, what I have tried to do is to add value by structuring them in a holistic, integrated way to provide solid background and context for our collaborative dialogue later on. So, my thoughts are both informed by my research experience with the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, but also my consulting work with Aurora Energy Research, consulting market participants on their latest challenges during this great energy transition. So my talk is divided into 3 parts. I will be very light on the first 2 parts because they have been very well covered by the previous speakers already. And I will focus mostly on the 3rd part, which is about the 3 market misalignments that we observe. So on physical infrastructure, we all currently understand that there are new system needs that are emerging because of requirements for flexibility and reliability to complement the uncertain and variable renewable energies that we have been adopting into our system. And also the flow of over the grid has been altering. And that demand-side innovation is making more and more service providers emerging and capable of meeting the challenges that we are currently encountering. The only point that I would like to add is the context specificity of physical challenges, which is the specific system needs that is required for any system is dependent on not only on its size. Large countries, while interconnected, usually has a better aggregated renewable resources that has overall less uncertainty and variation. But it's also dependent on the flexibility service that already exists within the system. A large hydro system is different from a large system mainly based on inflexible nuclear generation, for example. So context specificity will take us to the next section, which is on institutions, where specificity is also very important. So we have what I would like to call institutions, which Javier referred to as setups, which are the forms of coordinations that we use to make collective decisions. So we have 2 archetypes here on the slide, from the very centralized version where you have one vertically integrated utility, one player deciding all the investment and operational decisions within the sector, to a completely decentralized system where we use markets to coordinate many-to-many interaction. And in the real life, things tend to be hybrid. So, for example, there are many countries where one segment of the supply chain is open, typically in generation, while the other remains as a regulated and centralized setup. So this is why context specificity is already very important because renewable integration takes place not in a vacuum. It takes place in different countries with different institutional setup, and the particular solutions that might be most appropriate to them also depend on the starting point of such institutions. But the common challenge is to integrate those new system service providers into the power system so that we can collectively meet the new challenges the new system needs. As I promised, the most important section on the 3 market design misalignments. So overall, we can divide market design as a whole into 3 segments. We have the wholesale market, network regulation, and retail market. Network regulation, I admit, is not exactly a market, but it remains a regulated arrangement even in completely liberalized sectors because of the unique nature of the network segment. So I will speak of the 3 of them as a whole. So my 3 alignments each corresponds to one of those segments. And then I have to define the term misalignment that I've been using. What is a misalignment? So it is when unintentionally inefficient outcome arises in one part of the market due to incentive design in another part of the market. For example, we have a participant that is active in both market A and B, and whenever the outcome in market A changes the decision context for this participant and alters their decision in market B, leading to a less efficient outcome overall, we call this misalignment. So the first misalignment, which is in the wholesale market, the remuneration structure in the wholesale market as it is conventionally run is misaligned with new system needs. So thanks to renewable subsidy, renewable generation has been emerging out of their niche into mainstream. And because of subsidies, they do not need to recover all of their costs simply from market-based revenue. However, this is not the case for other generators. So in the wholesale market, the common practice is to price electricity based on the system marginal cost, which is the most expensive generation that's needed to meet incremental demand. And with the influx of a large amount of low marginal cost renewable energy, 2 things happen to conventional generators impacting their revenue. So the first one is a volume effect. Simply by being less expensive, renewable generators are displacing conventional thermal generators. They get to generate less. And the second is the price element, which is when you have lower price supplier in the supply stack, the price achieved by all generators most of the time is lower than it would be without those low marginal cost generators in place. So with falling volume and falling price, the conventional generators see their revenue in the energy market rapidly decline. And this is very challenging for them because conventional generators were built in an age and time where you expected to recover most of your cost from energy-based revenue in the wholesale market. So many of them could be considering mothballing or retiring. Is that a good thing? It depends. If it's a very inefficient coal-based baseload plant, maybe. But if it is a newly built CCGT plant with very flexible operation capabilities, then maybe not. We still need generators to provide complementary services that enhance our ability to integrate renewables. So the implication of this misalignment is that in the wholesale market, we need to be introducing or improving mechanisms that allows us to remunerate generators or or demand side for that matter to provide the needs that the system have. So, for example, in Ireland, which is a very small system compared to most countries, they're experiencing issues with integrating a large amount of wind because they are a relatively isolated system without the benefit of asynchronous connection with continental grid. And they're reforming their ancillary services design in order to be increasing their flexibility and increase the percentage of wind that can be included in the system at any time from 60% to 75%. And we need to further this process in order to push this percentage to even higher figure. In the network regulation, the misalignment happens between generation investment and underlying network capability. So both on the transmission side and on the distribution side, we have renewable generators connecting to the network. So they do not also take place in a vacuum. However, in most countries, partly to support the rollout of renewable generation, they are charged a shallow connection cost. Shallow means that they only bear the cost of connecting to the closest grid connection point, but the larger grid cost of network reinforcement and expansion, for example, to take offshore wind in very remote locations to large demand centers, that is socialized and borne collectively by all the grid users. So renewable generators don't always make the best decision in terms of siting decisions. And what is the implication for this? On the transmission side, in many jurisdictions, transmission system operators are seeing more instances of temporary or even permanent congestion, and that increases the cost for system operation. For example, in the UK, each year, National Grid spends around £1 billion to balance the network, and about 50% of that comes from transmission constraint. And then, on the distribution side, we see a mirror image. We also see the same type of dynamic emerging, which is the nature of flow over the distribution grid is becoming more complex. And that is an even larger challenge because the distributional grid is mostly a blind network. We have very low visibility and control into that layer. So this poses great operational challenges for distribution network operators. So flowing from this analysis of the problem, the conclusion would also be that we need to be increasingly aligning generation investment along with network capability enhancement and investment so that they are converging to an optimal system outcome instead of just optimizing one segment and having inefficient outcomes throughout overall at the system. And then in the retail market, we see misalignment in the form of pricing structure that do not properly fit with the range of consumer choices that are available. So in the retail market, so currently renewable subsidies are most commonly levied as a charge to consumers via a per unit energy charge. And what is also levied as a per unit energy charge is typically the network cost and also the balancing cost that's required for system operation. And that leads to retail bills having a very high per energy component. This is a disincentivizing force for us to further roll out electrification because the higher the price of electricity, the less likely heating and transportation will be electrified. And another important part of the misalignment is that retail signals in most countries are flat and in a very simplified form and is static over possibly many months or even many years. And this does not provide an efficient signal to electricity prosumers these days who have a wide range of capabilities that are sometimes available and willing to offer to the system operator and the grid at large in order to improve the operation of the system. And to another point, to close this loop over there, which is we have renewable distributed generation is becoming cheaper, and sometimes they are accompanied by favorable government subsidies. And that drives electricity consumers to have more self-generation at the expense of grid-connected consumption. This decreases overall transmission-connected demand and the cost base over which costs like renewable subsidy and network costs are recovered. So this is the vicious loop that Javier has mentioned, which is the grid defection loop. The higher the retail price, the lower the grid-connected demand, and over time, our ability to maintain the centralized grid will decrease, whereas that it's not necessarily the system outcomes that we want to see. And flowing from that, the conclusion for the retail market design is that we will need to better integrate the pricing structure in retail prices, along with the range of decisions that consumers have available, and better incentivizing them to work for the system instead of against the system. To summarize, 3 misalignments in 3 segments of market design. At the wholesale level, remuneration is misaligned with emerging system needs, flexibility, reliability. At the network level, generation investment is misaligned with network capability. At the retail level, pricing structure is misaligned with the range of consumer choices available. And in the bottom of the table, we see some of the options that have been tried in different countries and or have been just presented in literature. In the first bucket, ancillary service market, balancing market, capacity market, they are not new. They have already been implemented in many countries, from Ireland to GB to even Canada, Ontario. But then which configuration of these markets we need and what's a balancing force between them, like I mentioned in the beginning, need to be designed based on the specific context of the jurisdiction in question. And in the network segment, the key momentum is to somehow pass this locational signal to generators so that they can make more informed decisions as to what the underlying network capability is. And sometimes it takes it takes the form of a more spatially differentiated connection fee or network access tariff, but we can also combine that with energy price and form nodal pricing so that their revenue is also tied to the location in which they're based. So as to incentivize them to pick the best location to install their generation installation. And then in the retail segment, this is in real life, we have where the least real practice has happened, and it's mostly at a debate stage in the academia. And some of my colleagues at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies have suggested to change retail pricing structure to not be simply based on energy, but put more focus on the underlying network capacity that consumer requires and also the level of reliability at which they want their power. Are they willing to follow the trends of the wind and the solar, or are they willing to pay a premium in order to have firm energy access at all time? So now I only have, I'm 4 seconds over time, but I think I'm quite close. Not quite beat Javier, but getting close. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Donna. Yes, you were as good as Javier, even better, in my opinion. But thank you. You shared with us so many things. Only on the last slide, we can have a conference only on the point that you mentioned in the last slide. But one of the points that give us the perfect link with the next presentation from our colleague from Mexico is the important to keep into consideration the network situation and the link between generation and network capability, which I think is one of the factors that Mexico took into consideration in their very successful auctions. So I would like now to introduce our next speakers. Is Ivan Cayeme Villarreal, is Director General from the Ministry of Energy in Mexico, and he will tell us about the successful story of auction in Mexico, and including this locational signal that was mentioned before. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank IRENA very much for their kind invitation and support to come and talk to you about what Mexico is doing to promote the deployment of renewables. Which way should I point? I'm not sure why. Uh-oh, we're going to have a problem. I'm not sure what happened. Yeah, sure.
Yes, I think it's better to, unless we solve immediately. No, we are not solving immediately. Okay. Issue with technology in the innovation technologies week, it's interesting. Please don't tweet these issues. So now we can, I think now we can go in a bit more in detail in a few aspects, and with Christopher we will analyze some specific element of the network and embed the network. Thank you, Christopher. In the meantime, if we can fix, thank you. And I would like to remind you that with the app, we can you can have the possibility to ask questions, and then will be visualized in the screen at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Please, Christopher.
Let's see if I can get my slides up now. Do you want me to I can just go without slides? Is that all right? I'll just crack on without the slides. All right, so I was going to talk about something that's quite specific as opposed to sort of an overarching market design. Now, here we go. All right. And that specific thing is a term in Australia called embedded networks, which is kind of a fancy term for just running a private network, which is really nothing new. But for sort of the past 5 years in Australia, private networks were sort of reserved for the larger end. So like Sydney Airport is a private network, and Westfield shopping centers run private networks. And the reason why they do that is because they can negotiate with their retailer a really keen rate. They pass that keen rate onto their tenancies, and then they take a tidy little revenue stream out of that. That's really the main reason why they've come about. And some smaller operators have said, hey, if these guys can do it, we can do it as well. So we're starting to see a rise of embedded networks, or what are now called embedded networks in Australia, and various different applications. And because of the rise of these private networks, we've seen a response from the regulator, the market commission, and the market operator to say, all right, we need to formalize this because it's an unregulated, these are unregulated networks that are popping up. So over the past sort of 3 years, they've come up with something called Power of Choice, which does a few different things. It creates a framework for these embedded networks to operate within. It creates a formal AMO or AER role, which is called the Embedded Network Manager, which has reporting responsibilities amongst other things. And it's also given rights to the consumer, because in the private networks, before these policy updates came in, the consumers were locked into their private network. You couldn't escape that. So if they were not giving you a fair market rate, too bad. You couldn't get out of it. Now with this, there's a whole bunch of policy that's come into play that gives rights to the consumer, reporting responsibilities, and all that. And what's really come out of this is, because it's been formalized, the growth that we've seen in this market has been huge. And it's really exciting in Australia to see what's going on. And the reason for that is, let's skip to this slide. So 90% of the Australian population lives in an urban center. So Australia is pretty big. It's about the size of the continental United States, but it only has 25 million people. And they all must really like each other because they all sort of coalesce in the same area. Australia's renewable energy market is sort of developed backwards to most countries, where in most countries you have sort of the utility scale developing first, whereas in Australia, because of the incentives that were in place, we had the rooftop market develop first. So the rooftop market in the residential and C&I level is kind of saturated. And so the embedded network tool really unlocks this tenancy market, because a large amount of businesses and people live in tenancies. Just going back to this one. So an embedded network is a fairly easy concept to explain. You have a parent meter, which has a negotiated retail tariff structure with a formal retailer. And then behind that parent meter, you have child meters for all your tenancies. And so you pass on that contract discount to all your tenancies. And we're seeing them popping up the sort of the no-brainers are, the airport and the shopping centers, but we're seeing them at retirement villages, large property developments. University is also sort of a no-brainer, but even apartment blocks, 3-unit apartment blocks become embedded networks. And what can happen now that you have the embedded network management role is you can aggregate these. And when that happens, you get a lot of different potential. Talking about the growth of the embedded network, so 4,000 of them, the network exemptions have been around for several years. The embedded network's fairly new, but network exemptions, I know 4,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but relative to the size of Australia, it is. And if you look at the growth of them, 1,000 of them have come online just in the past 6 months. And that's largely due to the formalization. So the rules for the embedded network have come in place since December 2017. And since then, we've had a huge growth in embedded networks, companies that call themselves embedded network managers. And these companies bring a number of things to the table, which further unlocks distributed energy. So they bring a legal framework. So if you have a third party bringing in solar, selling a PPA, they have a legal framework between landlord and tenancy. So that's done. They have a metering and reporting framework. So there's a standardized reporting that can report up to AMO if necessary. They have a financial framework in place, so for funding energy conservation measures, which is the next most exciting part of that. So like I said, the main reason why this happens generally is because you get to negotiate a really keen retail arrangement with your retailer and hopefully pass on that benefit to your tenancies. But what's happening is we're seeing that the landlords, the owners, and the managers are further driving down their costs, and they're doing that by adding power factor correction, LED lights, solar, and now increasingly batteries. And when they do that, what we're really kind of getting to is a pathway towards a microgrid. And microgrid at an apartment block level. And we've seen those actually exist. And so I've added some buzzwords there at the bottom because this market mechanism really does check the boxes. So it creates a resilient network. There's strong social engagement. So some of the big policy updates that we've seen in Australia, they have no appreciation for it at the consumer level. Changing a clearing interval from 30 minutes to 5 minutes. The average consumer doesn't know what that means. But when you start talking about an embedded network to these people, they get it because it's directly impacting their business. The electricity prices in Australia are very high. And so also the market, the tariff structure is fairly complex. So if there are ways to drive down their costs, they understand what that means and they get it. So there's really high engagement, not only at the landlord level or the owner level, but also at the tenancy level. So when you start adding all these new technologies to an embedded network, what we see is that they are adding a range of value, not only to the tenancies and the landlord and the embedded network manager, but also to the grid at large. So we're seeing embedded networks that are performing or playing at the FCAS market or the frequency control market, locally at the voltage regulation market. They're providing voltage regulation services. And then an easy one for them to tick off is demand response as well. So demand response is a huge growth market in Australia as well. And then, of course, if you got energy storage there, you can perform tariff arbitrage, demand reduction, PV self-consumption, all within the premise. And the tenancy doesn't have to worry about that at all. It's all sort of transparent to them. The embedded network manager takes care of all that. And also we've seen embedded networks pop up where there's congestion relief or that network deferment needs to occur. So at the end of the line, you'd have to have a substation upgrade or addition of lines. Instead of doing that, they add an embedded network and solar and storage, and they're able to work with the network to defer further CapEx. I believe that's it from me. Finished a bit early, so more time for you guys.
Thank you, Christopher. Many interesting points. It's impressive that 90% of the embedded network came online just in the past 5 years. It's really impressive. And another very interesting element is what you highlighted regarding the site that have the capability to provide services to the grid. So basically are a resource for the grid. In frequency, voltage, and demand resource. And this is another element very important now, the link between embedded or distribution network and transmission system operator. So that's particularly important. Now I hope the presentation will work for our colleague from Mexico. Please, Kayema, you have the floor. Thank you.
Sorry about that. As I was going to tell you, 5 years ago, we had a major reform in the energy sector in Mexico. We wanted to improve prices and services for final users. We wanted to increase the use of clean energies in the mix. We had already by then a goal established in law that said that we had to have 35% of our generation coming from clean sources by 2024. And we also wanted to promote investment and employment. We knew at the time that it was going to be hard for the former state monopoly to fulfill the energy needs for the future all by itself. So we wanted to attract private investment. So what we did was to change the entire industry. We completely liberalized the generation and retail segments of the sector and created a wholesale electricity market, which started operations in 2016. we unbundled the state monopoly. We split it into 13, if I remember correctly, affiliates and subsidiaries. And we created the clean energy certificates, which didn't exist before in Mexico, among some other things. So the long-term electricity auctions. The long-term auctions are one of the 5 components of the wholesale electricity market in Mexico, and their objectives are to incent the deployment of renewable technologies, to help in price discovery of these technologies, of course, to reduce investment risks, and related to this, to promote a stable income, a stable source of revenues for generators, and also, of course, to guarantee a stable price for final users. There are 3 products offered in the auctions, which are clean energy certificates, energy, and capacity. Let me tell you a little bit about some features. One important feature is that renewable technologies can bid on all 3 products that I mentioned, energy, capacity, and certificates, whereas conventional technologies can only bid on capacity. So this is the way we tilt the balance in favor of renewables. Auctions are held at least once a year for delivery starting 3 years later. And importantly, auctions are the only way that basic service retailers can get the products. They cannot go directly to a generator and get the products and sign a bilateral agreement. They have to go through the auctions. And we did this to promote competition. We did this to make sure that the state basic service retailer, which basically serves everyone pretty much everyone in the country right now, 42 million users, goes to the market and gets the products from the cheapest source, as opposed to going to its sister gencos and getting the products from them. Contracts are long-term in nature, 15 years for energy and capacity, 20 years for certificates. The developers can bid on either individual product, or they can bid on bundles of them. And auctions are technology neutral. Now, I want to talk to you about 2 important features of the auction design: the time and location dependent incentives. We want the projects to produce energy when it is most valuable to the system. So to achieve that, we introduced what we called hourly adjustment factors, which are basically a premium or penalty on the bidding price that will affect the seller's revenues if they win the bid. So what the operator does is that it forecasts market prices for every hour in every price zone in which the country is divided for the auction. There were 53 zones in last auction. And for each of the 15 years that the contracts last. They calculate these prices, and then they calculate the penalty based on premium or penalty based on these prices. So some premium penalty schedules will be more consistent with solar production profiles, for example, rewarding more the energy delivered during the day. And some other premium penalty schedules will be more consistent, for example, with wind production profiles. So in that way, we push the participants into designing the projects in such a way that they both maximize the revenues and the value to the system. We also want the projects to locate where it is most valuable to the system. So to do that, we also make known to the public another set of premium or penalty. This premium or penalty do not affect the revenues that the sellers are going to get if they win, but it does affect the selection process, and they know that. So what the operator does is that it calculates an average market price for the entire system. And then it calculates prices for each of the 53 zones in which the country was divided. And so the operator takes the bids in zones, the bidding prices in zones where the price is high relative to the average, meaning that the energy is more valued there, and it reduces the bidding prices, making those offers more likely to be selected. It takes the bids, then it takes the bidding prices which are in zones where the market price is low relative to the average, the system average, and it increases the bidding prices, making those projects less likely to be selected because they're going to go to zones where energy is less valued. And so the projects go to where energy is more valued. What do we get from these incentives? This is what we get. Solar projects tend to go to the northwest and central part of Mexico, where there is plenty of sunlight throughout the year. Wind projects tend to go to the northeast and south of Mexico, where there are good wind corridors because of the currents coming from the Pacific Ocean and the currents coming from the Gulf of Mexico. And many projects tend to go to the Yucatan Peninsula, which has no access to gas pipelines, and so the energy is pretty expensive there. So we get the projects to go where they're supposed to go and to produce when they're supposed to produce. I want to tell you a little bit about some results from the first 3 auctions that we've held. Prices have gone consistently down in the second and third auction. In the last auction that was held in November 2017, the average price for energy and certificates was $20.6 US, which is pretty competitive. Solar projects are competing now with coal and gas projects. We're expecting total investments for around $9 billion for 90 projects, which are going to add capacity for 7,500 megawatts, more or less. Currently, we're holding the 4th auction. We already got the buyers' offers. The numbers are looking very good. Private buyers could not participate in the first 2 auctions. They start participating in the 3rd auction. And the energy demand from last auction to this auction has increased significantly, almost 300%, from 540,000 megawatts and megawatt hours, to 2 million. So we're pretty happy about this. The auctions are really taking off. The buyers are realizing that this is the best way to get competitive prices for a long period of time. And demand for capacity is also increasing. It increased 50% from the last auction to this auction. So what do we expect to get from this? Well, we really expect to increase penetration from renewables. From the share of in capacity, in generation capacity as of now is around 26%, more or less. And we expect that to increase to around 37% by 2032. The share of generation itself is 17% of renewables right now, and we expect that to increase to 20% more or less in 2032. There is, of course, a lot of things to do still. Our market is in its infancy. As I said, I think it started operations 2 years ago, so we have to improve a lot of things. We have to start working on flexibility issues, for example. We have no specific remuneration mechanisms for that. But we trust that with discussions such as this one help us improve our regulatory framework. And I thank IRENA again for their support. And I hope I'll see some of you as buyers or sellers next year in the 5th auction, if I'm allowed the commercial. Thank you again.
Thank you, and congratulations for the impressive result of the auction for your ambitious plan. Now we have the last but not least speaker, David Nelson, Executive Director of Climate Policy Initiative. Please, David. And let me remind you that with the Attendify app, you can join the app and select question and answer for the speakers.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks all the speakers beforehand. My job here today, hopefully if the slides work, is to add just a little bit more to what I think a number of the speakers have talked about, and then try to pull it all together and see what this actually means for what market design might look like coming in the future. And the good news is it's not so far away from where we have. Some key messages, some key insights. First of all, the economics of electricity markets are really changing. I'll go through that very quickly. And they're not just changing in lower costs, they're changing in what is the components of costs. We need to develop incentives around different sources of flexibility. And all of this, the cost of finance is so important, and we never should forget that, because market design is mostly about trying to keep the appropriate investors and the appropriate cost of finance in place. The current approaches to electricity market design solve some of the problems, but actually they create a lot of others. And so the idea is to get them to solve the problems that we need to solve and segregate it in a way that solves those problems that need to be solved without creating the issues. And as I said, I'll put a low-cost way forward. Some work we did a couple of years ago, this is a little dated, we wanted to start from a blank sheet of paper and say, well, what would happen if you started and you built an electricity grid from scratch? You could either build it with technologies that were infinitely scalable, so we ignored all the hydro and such you had. We actually ignored the demand management in this. What would the cost be if you built it with only CCGTs, or you built it with a combination of renewable energy and some gas to provide backup? It turns out with today's costs, the cost of renewable energy system is just about the same price. And in fact, at the same price at $50 a ton carbon tax. By 2030, with the reductions of costs, we see that a system built entirely out of renewable energy will be cheaper than one built out of cost, even when you include a gas, even when you include the flexibility costs. Now, if you pull back in the value of existing power plants to use as flexible sources, hydro, and demand manage it, we think that flexibility cost will actually be lower. So this number that shows $70 a megawatt hour would actually get to 50 to 55, depending on the market. The key here is that flexibility is now almost half of the cost here. When we talk about flexibility, what we need to think about is not just day-night balancing, but there's a whole series you need to think about, from the 1-minute balancing to the daily ramping to seasonal balancing. It turns out that any clean energy source increases the amount of flexibility you need. Nuclear, because it is the high capital cost, means that it is less economically flexible, and renewables across the spectrum. There are a whole range of flexibility options. I won't go through these. I think they've been discussed earlier. But they fall on from the supply side to the demand side to conversion to other forms of energy. So making heat when there's energy available, direct electricity storage, and infrastructure. The key is, for each one of these flexibility options that we just talked about, can we find out which are the winning technologies here? We've done some work where we looked across all of the flexibility needs, not just the 5 we had out there, but there's many variations in between, and the technologies. And here is a ranking order of those costs. The dark blue represents those resources that we think are the lowest cost scalable resource at that time. So anything that's in red are ways that you save money. The one in blue is what would be the default backup technology for this flexibility need, and the one in the gray are out of the money. But what's important, if you look at the evolution towards 2030 costs, what you find is that the technologies change and the costs get lower. So we have to be thinking about this not just in terms of today's costs, but where we get those costs to. The key about integrating existing, for instance, CCGTs or hydro to lower the costs. This proves that point, showing it for an example in California, where we took the existing hydro and saw how it reduced the overall flexibility cost in California by about half. Again, I'll actually skip this in the interest of time because I want to get to the future market. But what this does show is that for each of the different flexibility needs, the technologies change that are the default technologies and those technologies that are low cost over time. In particular, you might look down at the lithium-ion batteries, which today are out of the money in creating short-term reserves or daily ramping in particular. But in 20 years, 15 years, they will definitely be in the money. So the next point to talk about is, let's go back to the current designs, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or a lot of arguments that we find going on about how markets should work. The typical market design that we talk about now, you basically stack up all the power plants by costs, you create a demand curve. What you then do is the price effectively in any day is determined by what is the marginal power plant that is needed at that point. It's a bit more complicated but I just want to simplify it for this point. The issue then is that you'll get an hourly price that a price that varies across the day depending on what is the marginal price. It can be very low, can even be negative overnight, and it will peak when demand is higher. That's all well and good when you are dispatching a plant that has fuel price risk, or that you can actually plan to turn on and off. But if you actually have a wind turbine, what you've done is, should you be giving somebody an incentive to have the wind blow at 5 o'clock in 2026 when they've made the investment decision in 2016? You're actually imposing a risk upon renewable providers that they needn't have. And this is part where the auctions really help. But what we find from investors is they look at the wholesale market price, and they look at the difference between the auction price and the wholesale market price as being an effective subsidy, and they view that subsidy as it increases as being a risk. And let's look at what happens when we go to a market where you have a lot of renewable energy in the system, 70, 80%. Well, you'll actually get, since there's zero variable cost of any of the renewable energy, you get a merit order, a stack like that on the left. It will be flat, zero most of the days. It will even be negative as you need incentives to start some generation plant to have it online for the peak. And then you'll have a single peak that might happen for 1 hour or something of that nature. You will have costs that no longer are providing incentives. So with zero and negative average wholesale prices, which we already see renewable energy reducing wholesale prices, not because energy costs are going, but because there's a lot of zero and negative price hours, this perception of what is the subsidy for renewable energy increases. In fact, we've got a crazy situation with existing markets where the cheaper renewable energy gets, the more renewable energy you build, the lower wholesale prices go, and the higher the implicit subsidy and therefore risk around renewable energy. The market is completely broken when you're going to an hourly market. To further put this argument, and this is some stuff we did in Germany a couple of years ago when we were looking at the EU directives and helping the German government on this. We looked, there is an orthodoxy in the market that there's economic value in curtailing renewable energy. And of course there is, if that incentive is given when you're making the final investment decision. If you know exactly how much you're going to be curtailed or what the limit of that curtail. But if you don't know, you impose a very significant risk. On the left, we modeled what would happen if you did not increase flexibility in Germany with the hours of curtailment. And you have to think as an investor about both the P50 case, that's a 50-50 probability that'll be a lower or higher, and the P90 case, that's the case that you assume will happen at 10% of the time. Because debt investors don't get the upside, they have to look at the P90 case. So what happens as curtailment goes up, they will reduce the amount of debt in the project, and therefore the cost of capital goes up. And in fact, our modeling at the time showed that because of the kind effects of increased renewable curtailment and uncertainty in the debt markets, the cost would go up by more than 50% because of the financial risk imposed by curtailment if it was not seen in advance. So the key is you need to have that decision when final investment decisions made so they can invest on that. So what do we need to do? And we're proposing a two-market design, one where we separate the fixed energy supply and yet put in the delivery of flexibility. Because those hourly markets, what they do is they create incredible incentives around delivering flexibility, particularly if they're not watered down by recovering some of your money from generation. So to keep finances low on the infrastructure part, the renewable energy, you need to match the risks to the time frame when decisions are made. That is very much the auctions that we saw in the Mexico case, where you know exactly what the relative price is, and that is what you're going to get at the beginning. You need to also be matching the risk profile to the appropriate investors. Actually, for renewable energy, it isn't utilities that should be investing in it. They're too expensive. Their cost of capital is too high. They have equity owners when these are actually, if you have a good auction, become basically debt instruments. It looks exactly like a debt instrument. You've got a large upfront capital payment, very low operating costs that you can manage out with operation and maintenance contracts. It should be actually planned that way. And so that's our energy market. On the second part, we have a delivery market, which is very much along the lines of the most sophisticated markets we have in places like Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland, which are hourly or sub-hourly prices based on marginal with locational incentives. So every node on the network has its own price so that you can actually take advantage of flexibility to meet distribution and transmission needs. And there are examples of this. So we had the Mexico example about the auctions. I have here the Brazil example. It needs to be a wholesale market built around annual biannual contracts where those, and the important thing here is that should become the effective wholesale market price. When we're quoting the electricity price, we shouldn't be quoting the sum of 8,760 hours of annual prices. We should be saying, well, what is the price of buying a kilowatt hour in an energy market? And this is just an aside. Once you have that market in place, what we have found is that there are different types of financial vehicles, not utility-owned, that particularly tie the cash flows from these to institutional investors. And our analysis shows that that would reduce the cost of capital, or the cost per kilowatt hour, by about 20%. So you get these markets in place, and then we change the structure of the industry. On the other side, you have a delivery market, which does look a lot more like where we're going to some of the markets. Now, the key here is that the energy kilowatt hour cost is a pass-through. Then what you do is you charge customers for the incremental cost of buying or of having that energy delivered at a particular time. Clearly, if you have rooftop solar, you don't have to pay a cost, but you'll be paying for the balancing cost, and it may be an export cost that you have. We have modeled this. Prices do vary strongly from various, so you might be buying your energy at $50 or $40 a megawatt hour, but the cost of delivery could be between negative $600 to positive $3,000 a megawatt hour. So we've also seen that what happens with coal plants is they can change from operating at 80% load factor to operating at 20% load factor, but be almost as profitable because you're paying them for the flexibility that they deliver. So how does this work? Well, you have a consumer, buys a long-term energy contract or builds his own. He can then either go directly to the delivery market operator and pay the delivery charge that would happen at that particular hour, or he can go to an aggregator. And the key is these aggregators would be able to themselves invest in storage capacity, or they might be able to go into your property and say, this is 5 different ways we can tune, and if you give us control over your electric battery charging or your appliances, or we might even invest in demand-side management, insulation in your house. If you do all these things, we will offer you tariff X. If you do half of them, we'll offer you tariff Y. This will give the aggregators the ability to actually access, and as we're showing here, you can access your own supplies. Your flexible hydro would be in here. A lot of the flexible generation, so a lot of the GTs and CCGTs would actually choose, because it's more economic for them to participate in this market rather than in the main market. And so that provides the basic bones of the overall of an overall plan going forward. And the good news, as I run out of time, is that we're partway there. We've got all of the components. We've done various pieces of this in different markets, but it is now making this the orthodoxy so that we can get on with the task of reorganizing our industries, of investing in technology development, and just reshaping our industry so that these defaults are what investors are investing in. And when you do that, we think that there's a 20% cost advantage to be had in the financing of the clean energy, and another 20% cost advantage to be had in the long-term cost of flexibility. There is a tremendous amount to be had there, and we just have to make sure that we move in this path.
Thank you very much. And we have 10 minutes for some questions. I have received some of them. I would like to start with Donna. Donna, you mentioned the different misalignment, the three main misalignment. But what are the main barriers for realizing the suggested changes? And the question is particular for retail, but of course it's up to you to articulate. And while you answer this question, I would like to ask two other questions for the other panelists so they can think about it. The first is, do you believe locational pricing in short-term market will help in long-term generation investment in congested areas? And the second one is about capacity market. If there is an innovation in capacity market that could support the integration of variable renewables into the system. So I will ask the other speakers to comment on and get back on this question, while you, Donna, please answer the first question. Thank you.
So the value of correcting misalignment, especially in the retail market, is that, like we've said, there is emerging capabilities that is developing on the demand side, within the consumers. We are seeing electrification of either transport connecting new types of demand, but within that is also new potential for large resources for flexibility to be fed back into the grid. And then if we resolve the misalignment, which is the fact that consumers now do not have a window into what's happening in the power system, and therefore adjust their own consumption and generation or even storage accordingly, then we're missing out on the capability that they have. So we want to be inclusive and empower the localize the distributed actors so that they can make the best use of the capabilities that they already have.
Thank you, Donna. And what about the other sectors, the other two sectors? With this, any other thought on the other main action that you would prioritize, let's say?
So we have to look at the whole market design as an integrated way. I have presented them as three separate issues, but when we think about it, they're all connected actually, because wholesale market, I said that we should improve the provision, the procurement of flexibility, and that might come from the retail market. So therefore, we might be bridging the whole two markets and just remove the wall between wholesale and retail altogether. And then secondly, as for network regulation, I said there the main momentum impetus is to increase the locational awareness for generators and consumers. And then you should reflect that in the wholesale market and the retail market as well. So those issues, when we talk about them, we only present things in a linear way, so they seem quite distinct. But actually, the whole view is circular, which is very hard to capture in speech.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Donna. If anybody want to answer, please, David, to the other two questions that I asked before.
So with respect to short-term locational marginal pricing models, it helps, but in and of itself, it is really, really, really expensive. If you think about an investor, think if I were, again, going to the debt investor, and I'm going to lend to a project that will have 1 hour that may or may not be at $3,000 a megawatt hour, do I lend money? No, right? I need some sort of certainty. Now, you get around that because aggregators will put together, and the idea is that an aggregator will put together various and be able to trade in the market and create some sort of predictability. But again, you're taking on so much risk that this requires a really high rate of return. And that leads you to your capacity markets. The issue around capacity markets is clearly that it's capacity markets for what, right? Having long-term capacity markets in place that might be locationally specific or for spinning reserve or any particular pieces help, but I think you have to think about clearly how this fits into the overall objectives and the needs that you have. Capacity markets for developing certain technologies may also be helpful, but the key is they're long-term markets. You know, going to the old and you know, I started in the UK with privatizing the UK electricity industry, and we had these debates in the 1980s, and the short-term capacity markets or value of lost load we have was a short-term solution. We knew that in the long term you wouldn't drive investment decisions unless you had this security of supply, and we haven't gotten any further. But I think a lot of the discussion about capacity markets misses the point of what we're trying to do. The second thing that you have when you think about capacity markets is that right now we have plenty of generation capacity, right? It's more about providing those individual flexibility services. And so let's focus on how we need to incentivize the lowest cost fixed and operating cost portions of those flexibility services rather than getting a generic solution that's going to create as many problems as it started.
Yeah, in fact, it's one of the hot points of debate, right? Ivan, I saw you were taking notes. You may want to add, please.
No, I was actually learning from him.
There is one question on embedded network, Chris, and maybe this can be the last one because I myself promised the organizer to be in time at 12:30 for the lunch. Can neighboring embedded networks be linked to enable peer-to-peer transaction, and what is the role of utilities in this setup?
Yes, they can. And there's actually an example of that in Cornell, Sydney. They actually use the Sonnen battery to do peer-to-peer via blockchain. There's just an article about that. And they don't actually have to be physically linked. They're all linked to the network at large. And there's not a whole, I don't think there's a whole lot of reason to have peer-to-peer energy trading between the two embedded networks or many embedded networks because they play with the grid, generally speaking. So they're tariff arbitraging and selling to the retail market, but also there's an ability for them to play at the wholesale market through FCAS and demand response. So peer-to-peer, there might be a market for that, but that's generally not what they're set up for. I think the one I referenced in Cornell is more of a pilot project. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. With this, we have to conclude the session. I would like to thank all of you for attending the session, and please join me in thanking the speakers for this interesting insight. A special thank from me to the team and to Javier who helped out to organize the session. Thank you. The lunch is served outside here. Thank you very much.